The commandment we're going to look at this morning, do not steal. Do not steal, right? Of the 10 commandments that God gave to his people, one of them, very succinctly, says, do not steal. This makes a lot of sense, right? I think most of us are on board with the do not steal commandment, at least most of the time. If you imagine a society where everybody was just allowed to help themselves to whatever they wanted, no matter who it belongs to, that'd be a tough kind of society, right? There is such a thing as ownership. You have stuff on you right now that belongs to you. You have stuff in your car or at home and other places that belongs to you. And possession or ownership seems to be something that's sanctioned by God. It's permissible to us. We're allowed to own things. And that's good because I think, for one, ownership makes responsibility possible. The fact that you own something, it gives you a sense of responsibility over that thing. Now, imagine if there was no such thing as possession or ownership, that everything just sort of belonged communally to everyone. I imagine at some point there'd probably be a lot of neglect, for those various things, right? Because nobody in particular was especially responsible for that thing. So ownership makes responsibility possible. But in order for ownership to work, it requires respect, right? Ownership requires respect from others in order for it to work properly. If I'm going to own something, I need to have a sense in which, like, that ownership, that privilege of ownership is protected. I need the respect of other people over what I own. So why do people steal? I think a lot of times people steal because they've convinced themselves that they have the right to take what they want. Perhaps they've justified that by thinking that they need it more than the person who currently possesses it. Or perhaps they look at what this other person has and they say, well, that's too much, right? This person, this company, that it's too much, and so they just help themselves. Or perhaps a lot of times stealing just comes very plainly out of greed. But we wouldn't steal anything, right? We wouldn't do that, right? We would never steal anything, right? Here's some things we might steal. I just got this little list here that may or may not have any, implication for you. How about taking credit for somebody else's work? Would that be stealing? This is a big one. Again, probably doesn't affect any of us here, but how about time wasted at our jobs? Or doing less than is expected because we can get away with it? What about leveraging a company's resources for our own personal benefit, right? Just taking advantage of this perk or that we don't really have at our disposal, but it's going to go unnoticed. Nobody's really going to be paying any attention to that. What about not paying for a debt that we have, for something we've borrowed? Not paying a debt back, not paying back this obligation. And this is a tough one as we're approaching April 15th, but what about fudging our numbers for our personal tax return? Right? Would that be stealing? Oh, no, the government's got plenty of money. It's just the government after all, right? Victimless crime, not paying our fair share of taxes. How about those of us that maybe perform services for other people, where, especially there isn't in particular a retail price for something. You go into a store and there's a tag on every item that you buy that says this is how much you're going to pay for it, and so it's pretty clear. But a lot of times we have interactions with one another where people are providing services, and I just wonder, have we been guilty of overcharging a customer intentionally, perhaps, or even by mistake, right? Mistakenly overcharging a customer for something and then discovering it and now having this crisis of conscience of, well, the customer seemed perfectly content to pay what I overcharged them, but I also know in my conscience that I didn't actually earn all of that money, and so do I give it back to them or do I just consider it a blessing from Jesus? What about something that belongs to God? We ever stolen from God? Exodus 22, which is part of a series of all these ways in which the people of Israel govern, has very, very matter-of-fact rules in a variety of cases of theft and loss. So there's these prescriptions. If such and such happens, then this is what needs to be done in order to make it right, to make restitution. I want to look for just a moment at Leviticus chapter 6, verses 2 and 3, that also talks about theft or stealing. It says something very interesting here. Here in Leviticus, it says, when someone sins and offends the Lord by deceiving his neighbor in regard to a deposit or a security or a robbery, or defrauds his neighbor, or finds something lost and lies about it. Here, stealing is equated with deception, right? Deceiving another person. That deceit is acting unfaithfully or with disloyalty towards someone else. In other words, it's treating somebody unfairly. When I was a kid, I collected baseball cards, and so sometimes I bought cards that came in packages from a store, but a lot of times we'd go to baseball card, sports card shows, right, where there'd be all kinds of people with their collections of cards that they were selling or buying or perhaps trading. And of course, you trade with your friends. And anytime somebody suggested a trade, or anytime you were looking at purchasing something specifically, there was always this fear that you were going to be taken advantage of, right? Take, for instance, you go into this massive exhibit hall with all of these professionals that know all the ins and outs of all this collectible memorabilia, right? And they're charging certain amounts for those things, and you want to know that you're not being taken advantage of, that I don't have as much knowledge as this other person does. And so there is this hopeful expectation that we have in our dealings with one another that we're going to be treated fairly. How many of you, when you go and get your car serviced, you want to be treated fairly, right? That's a really difficult place because a dealership or some independent automotive place, they can tell you it's going to cost such and such. And I don't know about you, but I've had many, many experiences where they come back and they say it's going to cost $1,273. What? But I don't know. So we want to be treated fairly. Here, not treating people fairly, taking advantage of those that you're able to take advantage of, pulling a fast one on someone, is considered to be an offense to God, right? That's how it's described here. It says, when someone sins and offends the Lord by deceiving his neighbor, that is, when you deceive your neighbor, it may look like there's just simply this sort of horizontal transaction that's occurring between you and another person, but the Bible describes it as an offense to the Lord. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 1 says, dishonest scales are detestable to the Lord, but an accurate weight is his delight. Do you love the language there? Like, if God were going to get angry about something, what is it that he'd get angry about, right? We probably come up with all kinds of guesses about the things that would make God the most angry. Here we're told that what's detestable to the Lord, dishonest scales. What's a dishonest scale? A dishonest scale, it's a scale that it just manipulates the numbers a little bit, right? It's the thing being weighed weighs a pound, but the scale shows that it weighs a pound and an ounce. I mean, come on, who's going to know the difference, right? Like, how many more pieces of salami is this person missing because I charge them for a pound and an ounce versus just a pound, right? Dishonest scales are detestable to the Lord, but an accurate weight is his delight. It's almost as if when God sees two people treating each other fairly in their dealings with one another, that God is skipping around, delighted that the humans he has created are treating each other as they ought to. Leviticus also talks about this thing called defrauding our neighbor. Defrauding carries the idea of disguising or concealing something in order to gain something. You think about something like embezzlement, right? This would be defrauding. It's concealing, it's hiding something, it's keeping something outside of other people's notice for my personal gain. Making a false promise that perhaps you don't intend to keep. It's different from, in particular, like breaking into a house and snatching away something. I mean, that's obviously theft, but so is the kind of thing that people do when they are concealing things in order to gain for themselves. Now, defrauding is done where we think that we are escaping the notice of other human beings, but defrauding someone also assumes that it escapes God's notice. Did you know that every single time, for all of time, that one person has defrauded another, God noticed? He knows that, right? But we have to be careful that we don't allow ourselves to be in a position where we're taking advantage of someone else. Because again, when someone deceives or defrauds his neighbor, it's an offense to God. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 13 says this, specifically with regard to an employer. Do not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages due a hired worker must not remain with you until morning. Right? The reason why this commandment was given here, or these instructions for how an employer was to pay his employees, is it wasn't like it is for us today, where we go to work and we get paid once a week, or perhaps once every other week, or maybe twice a month. People lived really day to day. What a person went and earned in a given day, they needed that money in order to feed their family that day. And so for an employer to treat his employee dishonestly by holding back what was due to him was considered robbery, right? Taking advantage of somebody else. And so those of us that find ourselves in positions where we are employing others, we have to be very careful that we are treating those who are working for us honestly, however that may look for our particular context. Now, if you're an employee, it also works the other way. Romans chapter 13, verse 7 says, pay your obligations to everyone, right? This is a universal commandment. Whatever obligation you may have toward another person, you need to pay it. I need to pay it. Taxes to those who you owe taxes, tolls to those who you owe tolls, respect to those who you owe respect, and honor to those you owe honor. So employers have the responsibility of treating their employees fairly in the wages that they're paying for them, or else they're stealing from them. Employees are responsible to their employers, right? We already talked about the possibility that we can steal time away, right? Or take advantage of some particular perk, and we might just think, oh, it's a little bit here or there. But all those little bits eventually add up into massive losses. You know, corporations, I think, one of the greatest losses that they assume are the losses attributed to the theft of time on the part of their employees. There's really no way for us to exactly calculate just how much it is, but we know it's there. The golden rule, I think, is instructive for us in whatever situation we find ourselves dealing with one another, right? The golden rule says treat others the way you want to be treated. And so if you're a person that is employing another, treat that employee, treat those employees the way you would want to be treated if you were in their position. If you're an employee, right, I know it's easy to kind of look at the man, right, and they're just taking advantage of you, and somebody else is getting rich off the hard work that you're doing. I know it's easy to have that kind of attitude, but if we're going to bring our attitudes and our behaviors within the realm of being obedient to Jesus, we need to look at it differently, right? And we need to essentially do what we would want to be done for us, even if we might feel like, for a moment we're not getting a fair shake, right? That's perhaps out of our control. We are still obligated to do what we know we ought to do. Now, let's say we get all of this right with one another all the time, with every human being and every interaction that we have. Another question we might look at when it comes to stealing is, well, do we also get this right with God? Do we get this right with God? I want to say that we who are following Jesus should be very careful not to steal from God by failing to put him first. Right? The way in which people who are following Jesus steal from God is by failing to put God first. Right? That is something that is required of us. Now, if you're here today and you're not a follower of Jesus, you're not a Christian, I want you to relax and I'm going to say some things that are for the other folks that are in the room. Okay, this is not for you. This is not to make you feel bad or feel guilty, or when we receive the offering in a handful of minutes, make you feel like you've got to do something. You have to react to this, okay? I want to talk for a few moments to those who are following Jesus. And for those of you who are following Jesus, when we talk about this thing of giving God what we owe to God, I want you to know that there's a tremendous amount of grace in this, right? I'm not trying to make you feel ashamed or embarrassed for anything that you may not be doing that we might find here that we should be doing. But I also, while please understand that this is, there's a lot of grace in this, understand this is also a very, very serious thing for us to think about, all right? Are we actually ever guilty of stealing from God? We get some instructions in the prophetic book called Malachi. It's the last prophetic book in the Old Testament. So before Jesus came, this is sort of like the last word that God had with his people before Jesus came into our world. And so here we have quoted what God is accusing the nation of Israel of. Okay? He says, "Ever since the days of your ancestors, you have scorned my decrees and failed to obey them. Now return to me, and I will return to you, says the Lord of heaven's armies. But you ask, how can we return when we have never gone away?" So just for us to get the picture, God's looking at his people, and he said, listen, you have all, as a nation, you have all really, really struggled from the beginning of time, right? We can go back to the very beginning. We can look at how it was for your ancestors leading all the way up to this present time. You all have struggled with this. Struggled with what? Well, you've struggled with the commandments that I've given to you for you to live by. You have scorned them. You have brushed them aside. You have considered them as perhaps unimportant or optional, or however you want to describe it. But what you have essentially done is you failed to obey them, right? They were treating God's commands similarly to how you and I treat the traffic laws that we are not really all that jazzed up about, right? The speed limit, it's not the limit, it's the suggestion, right? It's a speed suggestion. Do I really need to stop at every stop sign, or, it's a really quiet time on the roads right now, and I'm just going to roll on, right? Wait, we all carry into our driving habits just certain dismissals of certain laws, right, that we don't really regard as all that important. That's what the nation of Israel was doing with the laws of God. He describes it as they scorned God's law. Ultimately, they didn't obey what God had told them to do. Now they ask, how can we return when we have never gone away? Because God sets up this picture that they departed from him. That by not adhering to the laws that he had given for them to live by, they had drifted away. They had found themselves now here presently, as they were being accused of this, as just being away from God. They say, well, how have we drifted? How have we departed from you, right? And we got to ask ourselves, when it comes to what God has required of us, what God has commanded of us, when God says this is how it is to be, do we treat those things with real seriousness as, oh, well, God said I need to do this, I'm going to do it, or do we treat it more like those traffic laws that we just don't really care all that much about? Have we drifted from God by our unwillingness to surrender to what he has asked us to do? Have we drifted from God and we haven't even noticed? This happens all the time, right? People maybe for a period of time have this really deep affection and devotion toward God and surrender to Jesus and all that, and then life happens, and we're flawed human beings, and we get distracted, and it's easy sometimes if we're not paying attention, because following Jesus requires deliberance. It requires perseverance. It requires that we work toward continuing to follow Jesus. And when we stop paying attention to that, when we get a little loose, we drift away. Just like something that's not anchored in the ocean, it doesn't have to necessarily do anything proactively to move from one place to another. It will ultimately drift away with the tide or the wind. So have we drifted from God and not even noticed? Perhaps you've heard the story of the old couple, right? They were taking a Sunday drive, and they had one of those older style cars that didn't have the captain seats in the front. It was just a one big bench. How many of you have driven in one of those before? Right? And so they're off on the Sunday drive, and so there he is driving the car, and there she is over there on the passenger side, and it's quiet for a bit, and as they're just kind of enjoying the day and a view, it dawns on her that something's changed. And so she says to her husband, honey, years ago, whenever we take a drive like this, you and I would be cuddled right up to one another, right? And now look at all the space between us. And the man thought for a moment, and he finally said to her, well, I haven't moved. I haven't gone anywhere, right? And sometimes that's what happens with us, right? God's not hiding. He's not moving away from us. But a lot of times, again, when we're not careful to be attentive to our relationship with him and actively engaging in what it means to pursue and follow Jesus, we can find ourselves drifting away. And that's exactly how God described his relationship with the nation of Israel. And so God asked them this question, right? So they're looking like, how have we departed from you? And so God asked them this question. He says, should people cheat God? Should people that God created, people who depend on God for the very air that they breathe, should people cheat God? Well, of course not, we'd say. Well, people should not cheat God. And God says, now he accuses them. He says, yet you have cheated me. But you ask, well, what do you mean? When did we ever cheat you, right? So now their imagination is just being stirred. I don't remember ever sneaking into the temple and taking the holy things or doing anything that would be categorized or labeled as stealing or cheating. And so you ask, what do you mean? When did we ever cheat you? And God says, you have cheated me of the tithes and the offerings due to me. You are under a curse, for your whole nation has been cheating me. Right? This has been going along all the while. Bring all the tithes into the storehouse so there will be enough food in my house. So what we are told here is that tithes, this thing called the tithe, our tithes and offerings are due to God. Right? He uses that language. You withheld what was due to me. When we get our mail and we open it up and there's a bill there, right? It says how much we owe, to whom we owe, and there's also a due date, a deadline, right? There's this understanding that this bill that I'm holding it's not optional. I can't say, you know what? It would be awfully chummy of me to just go on ahead and pay this bill and help whoever it is that's benefiting from my paying this bill. Right? We don't do that. It's not optional. It's due. And so God describes that there is a portion of what he has blessed us with, what we have earned, that is not ours. It's due to him. And it should be enough that he just commanded it. It should be enough for us to obey simply that God commanded it, but there's also a why behind it. Right? In fact, there's probably a number of whys. A couple that I'll give you here. One is that giving our first tenth, right, that's what the tithe is. Whenever we say the word tithe, the word literally means a tenth. Whatever the land has produced, the first tenth of it belongs to the Lord. We'll get to that in a second, okay? So that's what we're talking about with the tithe. Giving our first tenth demonstrates priority God has in our lives. Now, let me be really, really clear. Giving tithes, giving offerings does not help you get into a more favorable position with God in terms of how he loves you. Right? God loves us, and that love is unconditional. Like it's not unconditional the way we throw away the word unconditional. It's literally unconditional. God loves us, right? And so anything that we do, whether we're talking about money or anything else, anything we do, whether we do it or do not do it, it does not affect the way in which God loves us. God loves us unconditionally. But what the tithe does do is it allows us to demonstrate something. Demonstrate what? Well, it demonstrates the priority that God has in our lives. And if you think about it, it makes sense. right? Again, we're talking to those of you that are professing to follow Jesus, walking in his footsteps. You're a disciple of Christ. It makes sense that if he is master and Lord of our lives, right? If God truly is our God and we truly are his people, it seems perfectly understandable that he might require something like this. It happens to those of us who are actively working right now. We see this happen every single time we get a paycheck, right? If you happen to work for somebody else or another company and you have earnings, you look at your pay stub, you have the gross amount that you earned, and then what happens? The government takes their part, right? How many of you get a letter in the mail from the government that says, hey, listen, after you've paid all your bills, you've gotten all the stuff you want, maybe gone out for a movie, right? Listen, if you got anything left over, can you just send it off to Uncle Sam? Can you do me a favor? Can you send it up to the treasurer of the state of Maine? Right? That doesn't happen. No, it just comes out, right? Right? We know that, when we think about what we earn, what we make, we generally don't even think about the gross amount. We think about the net amount. So conditioned have we been to the fact that the government gets there first. Well, giving our first tenth to God demonstrates the priority God has in our lives. Now, what God doesn't do is God doesn't go and take it from us like the government does. What he does is he puts into our arena the opportunity to be obedient to him in bringing him the first tenth. And that's why when we talk about the time of giving our tithes and offerings, we talk about it as a matter of worship, right? That what we are doing is we are exercising a measure of worship to God in that we are bringing our offerings to him. Giving our first tenth also breaks the power of greed in our lives. This is another, I think, important reason why God did this particular thing, why he instilled this within his covenant people, is because he understood that most of us really, really struggle with greed. Most of us really struggle with selfishness. Most of us we're the kind of givers that, again, like I just described, after we've taken care of everything else that we want to take care of, if there's something left over, then perhaps we'll use that in a token of generosity towards someone or something. Right? But giving our first tenth, it actually breaks the power of greed in our lives. If you're not doing this, just use your imagination for a second, okay? Just imagine what that would be like. And can we all agree that sounds a little crazy, like 10%? People in the world don't do this, right? People that aren't following Jesus, they don't just generally decide that they're going to give away 10% of their income. And yet that's what's required of those who are following Christ. It breaks the power of greed in our lives. When I just give that up, when I voluntarily surrender that back to God, you just, it's indescribable the change of posture you now have with regard to your money. Your money that you call my money. It all of a sudden starts to take on a whole new dimension. Leviticus chapter 27, verse 30 says, every tenth of the land's produce, grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It belongs to him. It is holy to the Lord, right? Get the picture of the farmer who's listening to this commandment, who looks out his window and he sees the fields and the harvest, right? That all falls within the boundaries of his property, right? And everything that has grown there has grown because he worked the soil, he tilled the land, he planted the seed, he did all of the things that he could do to try to control the harvest. And so it'd be very easy for him to look out and say, that is mine. But here we're given this picture that the 10th part belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord. Now, I know you're all really smart. I know that. And some of you you're already like 5 steps ahead of me, and you're thinking, Josh, I don't know if you're aware of this, but that's old covenant stuff. right? That's in the Old Testament. That's before we get to Jesus, and now this new covenant, this new internal law under which we live. We don't have to listen to the law of the tithe anymore. We're not under that obligation. And I'll just say there's a sense in which that's very, very true, right? We're not under any particular written law. That God writes his law on our hearts, those of us that have surrendered our lives to Jesus. We don't actually need external laws governing our behavior because our desires have been changed to follow God's laws. Now, the principle of the tithe, though, we have to understand, it actually predates the law. So, for those of you that are real sticklers about things, I just want you to know that even before the law was given to God's covenant people, the law of the tithe, the principle of the tithe, was already very, very much in place. Not only that, but how many of you like Jesus? How many of you love Jesus? Right? A few of you, okay. Right? Jesus affirmed the tithe. He didn't say, hey, don't ever worry about this anymore. He affirmed it. And if that's not enough for you, then I give you permission to go ahead and adopt for yourself the New Testament ethic when it comes to how we handle our money, right? If it's really, really hard for you to get your mind and your heart and your spirit wrapped around the idea of giving back a tenth to God as a demonstration that he is the priority in our lives, if that's just, you can't do that and you're like, listen, I am New Testament, I am New Covenant all the way, that's fine. The New Testament ethic, it's actually far worse, just so you know, right? Because the New Testament ethic is everything I have belongs to God. Everything I have belongs to God. Not 10%, it's actually 100%. It's 100%. I heard this illustration by an evangelist named J. John, who talked. And this helps because, whenever we talk about money, how many of you are feeling a little annoyed when we're talking about money in church? Come on, be honest, right? Right? Because we love our money. We don't want anybody talking about it, touching about it. So this guy, he used the illustration of donuts. He's like, all right, forget about it. Forget about money. Let's just pretend we all get paid with donuts. Okay? And so you earn 10 donuts for the work that you did this past week. So what we're talking about in this principle of the tithe is that you have 10 donuts, but one of them actually belongs not to you, it belongs to God. And you say, well, I earned the donuts. It's like, well, how did you earn the donuts? Did God give you the ability to earn the donuts? Did God have any part whatsoever in making it possible for you to earn the donuts? Yeah, I suppose he did do that. Okay, well, one of those donuts belongs to God. Okay, everybody with me so far? Anybody hungry? Okay. So one of those donuts belongs to God. Now, when I take that donut and I set it aside and I say, this is God's, what have I done? I have made that donut holy. See, the 10 donuts that we have, if I can use some religious terms here for a moment, those 10 donuts that we have, they're secular donuts. Okay, there's nothing sacred about them. They're secular. They're just ordinary donuts. Okay, but when I take the one donut and I set that apart, I distinguish it from the other 9. What I've done is I've made that donut holy. That belongs to God. Now, something happens when I do that. Not only is that donut made holy, but by the result of my sanctifying, making holy that donut, the other 9 donuts also now become holy. And they're available for me to use as a custodian of the donuts that have been given to me. And you know what? You could make a case that 9 holy donuts is more valuable than 10 unholy donuts. You see what I mean? Now, we have people from all different kind of like walks of life, like different places in life, right? Some of you are young, you've got families and lots of financial responsibilities. Some of you are older and perhaps kids have gone and you don't have any debt. You've paid off the house and the cars and so, you got some of you have 9 donuts and you need those 9 donuts. And God says, use those 9 donuts. Use them Use them in a way that's responsible. Use them in a way that honors me. But go ahead, use them. And then some of us, we have these 9 donuts, and we just happen to be in a place where I don't need all 9 donuts anymore. Right? How many of you don't need 9 donuts? Right? I don't need all 9 donuts. And so now I have an additional responsibility to perhaps give away some of those donuts. Right? Those donuts aren't just for me to do whatever I want with them. When I bring an understanding to the stuff that I have, the stuff that I've been given, the stuff that I've earned even, that it all belongs to God, it really, really changes the dynamic of how I see my stuff. What I need to see is that God owns all the donuts. God owns everything that I have. Now, on your communication card this morning, there's a place where you can check if you want to take the tithing challenge. I knew we were going to be talking about this today, and so we decided to put this on the back of the communication card, because my hope is that there's some of you out there that although the idea of working into your budget, into your financial system, the idea of giving 10%, the first 10% to God, like no questions asked, this belongs to God, I'm going to bring this to church, I'm not going to worry about it, it's God's, and I'm just going to give it to him, and that's it, and I'm going to make it work with the 90%. That for some of you might sound like this is the first time you ever heard of something so strange, crazy, and ludicrous as that. Some of you perhaps have heard about it, and you've wrestled with it over time. Feel like, man, that's something I'd really like to do, but I've never been able to get myself in a place where I feel like I can actually afford to do that. And so we talk about this tithing challenge. What we want to do is we want to encourage you to take a step of faith and try it. If you go on, we're not going to read the verses, but if you go on in Malachi, where God's having this conversation about the tithe with his people, he challenges them. He says, test me. Be obedient in this. Surrender this to me. Give me what is due to me, and then just wait and see. See if I don't open up the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing that you can't contain, right? And they talk in agrarian terms, right? Because they're farmers and sheep herders and things like that. And so he says, I will ensure that the harvest that you gain is better than it would have been if you weren't obedient to me in this matter. And so there's this principle, there's this understanding that, listen, this is not prosperity gospel. This isn't, hey, you give God $10, he's going to owe you 100, okay? This is not that junk you hear on TV all the time. I'm not making any promises that you're going to all of a sudden just like be overwhelmed with the miracles that are happening in your life because you're tithing. It might be the opposite. You might find it very, very challenging. You might find it really stretching your faith, like, oh, I can't believe I'm doing this. But I want you to feel at ease that like God's inviting us to take a step of faith. God's inviting us to have our faith stretched a little bit. And I don't know about you, but for most of us, I imagine the area of our lives in which we could experience the most stretching is probably the area of our finances. Right? That's why we don't like people talking about such private things. That's why we don't like coming to church and hearing the preacher talk about tithing. Don't you just love that last week we got to talk about sex and this week we got to talk about money? Isn't that great? I hope for some of you, like this is the first and second time you've ever come to Curtis Lake Church, but I want you to know we don't do this a whole lot, okay? We don't do this a whole lot, but it's important, right? Because Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. There's no better barometer. There's no better litmus test for us to discover where our heart actually is. I mean, I can say I love Jesus till I'm blue in the face. I can come around, right, and I can shake every one of your hands and talk to you about how much I love Jesus, right? But one of the great tests that actually would allow me to see fairly objectively, fairly honestly whether I do is, well, what am I doing with my money? Where's my money going? How's my money being spent? How's my money being given? Am I being obedient to God? Am I living in a way that demonstrates that I really put God first when it comes to my stuff? Let me close with this. How do we get ahead the right way? Oh, let me just say. So anyway, on your communication card, you can check the box if you want to sign up for the tithing challenge. That just helps us to know to pray for you. And if you want to talk to somebody about any of that, like, please come, set an appointment, come and talk to somebody. If you need, 5 minutes, we can make that happen after church today. If you need something longer than that, then we can set something else up. But I just don't want it to be lost on us that God wants for our faith to be stretched. So let me close with this. How do we get ahead the right way? Right? Because stealing is ultimately a shortcut to getting ahead. It's a shortcut to getting something that we want that we haven't earned. That's what stealing is. But we all want to do well. We all want to get ahead. So just very quickly, 4 principles for us. Number 1, work as hard as you ought to. Work as hard as you ought to. Now, I use the word ought there, and that's a very, very important word. Work as hard as you ought to. This isn't work as hard as you can. I mean, some of us, we can work really, really hard, and we can actually go way beyond what we ought to do, right? Because we're trying to, build up a bigger nest egg. We're trying to buy the bigger boat or get the better house, or, whatever the motivations are for us earning more money. We can obviously get to a place where we're sacrificing real life, real living, real godly living, because we're going after something that is just really, really unimportant. So work as hard as you ought to. And this also speaks to those who can't, for some reason or another, who can't work. Did you know the Bible never ever disparages a person that cannot work? That physically, or for some other reason is completely incapacitated to work. Like, that person is to be cared for. That person is to be helped by the rest of the society that comes around them, right? But if you can, you ought to. Work as hard as you ought to. Number 2, save wisely. Save wisely. There's tons and tons and tons of scriptures that encourage us to be wise with our money and to save, to put stuff away, to, sometimes things are going to happen. There's going to be an emergency. Something's going to come up that we didn't expect. How do we deal with that? The best way we can manage our finances is to ensure that we got a little socked away so that when an emergency happens, it becomes less of an emergency. It becomes more of a bummer. How many of you would rather have more bummers than emergencies, right? So save wisely. Now, don't hoard. Don't hoard, right? This is what we do in our affluent society. It's like we try to rack up as much as we can so that we can get to a place where we don't have to earn any more. And I don't really want to get too much into that, but we need to be careful to not hoard to this place where now we don't even need to trust God for anything. Number 3, share with others. Share with others. The beautiful picture of the New Testament community, right? The apostolic community, the beautiful picture there was that they shared with one another, right? Those that had much gave to those who had little. There was a genuine care and concern for the welfare and well-being of one another within the context of that community. And what we need to do is we need to really live out the command, do not steal. It's not just about not breaking into somebody's house and robbing from them. It's elevating the obligation that we feel toward one another so that we share with one another as we ought to. And then finally, put God first. And then trust him with everything else. Trust him with all your needs. Put God first. There's always going to be a reason to put God last or to let him fall down the list. There's always going to be a reason to do that, right? How many of you are just flush with cash? Right? Like, you got so much, you don't even know what to do with it. You're just looking for ways to throw the money away, right? Because it's just, no, that's not, no, we usually, live, if we try to live, most of us, according to our means. Maybe we're living even beyond our means, right? So there's always going to be some financial pressure for most of us. That's going to be our experience. And there's always going to be a reason to put off something like tithing. There's always going to be a reason to put off something like giving. There's always going to be a reason. I promise you, there will always be a reason to do that. But I want to encourage you, don't let it happen. Put God first, and then trust him with all